Well, I'm Tim Lang, that's me, and I'm at City University, London, just up the road, so this is my bailiwick, as it were. I run a unique centre on food policy. Utterly bizarrely, we are the only specialist academic group in the world focusing on food policy, which I still find bizarre, actually. Given the enormity and the importance of it all, you'd have thought, just listening to your conversation just now, it's got to be translated into policy terms. People have got to do things to address these abstract discussions. And that's what we work on. So I've come without, as others have done, PowerPoint, so I apologize for that, although I've done a PowerPoint of what I think we should talk about. But I'm going to make 5 points. Firstly, what's my focus? I know Kath, after me, is going to focus on some aspects of what I'm interested in us discussing, so I'll leave the examples to her, to explore to her. But the focus that I think we need to take on addressing this whole issue that you're talking about today is no good if we just think about health. I think we've got to rethink what we mean by health. And I'm someone who has argued in my boring academic work that we can't talk about human physiological health unless we're talking, if you like, about planetary health. Because human health depends upon what we now these days call ecosystems. Put it this way, the longevity of life expectancy, the growth of life spans in the 20th century was done not entirely, but heavily by destroying the environment, by literally mining the planet. The growth of food supply in the 20th century was essentially, and can be summed up in one word, oil. Oil is what gave the fertilizers, and it's actually fertilizers, which allowed the explosion of food production. Much more complicated than that, but if you just have 1 minute, just say to people, food equals oil, and suddenly everything changes. Calories, energy, oil, fertilizers. So the perspective I come from is, you know, my enemies and detractors would say airy fairy claptrap. I'm proud of being airy fairy claptrap in that sense, but it's a societal and a structural perspective, okay? Not individualized, but societal. And that discussion you were having after Susan's nice talk was exactly the sort of frameworks that I'm interested in. How do we shape the circumstances in which people make those small but significant choices that Susan was talking us through? And I'm someone who's interested in the framing assumptions. Broadly, visually, populations always have a variation, you know, from very fat to very thin, from rich to poor, etc. Think of it as a continuum, okay? In the 20th century, we've ended up over here. We're almost all fat, okay? We're all, in the Western world, over-consuming. We're over-consuming the planet. What we've got to get to is those variations being right over here, okay? Don't assume that there are just bad sets of people who are somehow the worst and there are some real star performers. Just think population. We've got to move it from my left hand to right hand, from there to there. Get it? So that's the sort of picture I have. How can we reshape the conditions under which good health will happen, as opposed to carry on shaping the conditions for bad health to happen? That's it in one sentence. So that's my focus, and that's the focus I'd really like you to grapple with. And I was saying to Nigel, where is he, Nigel? I said this is there's a sense in politics at the moment of déjà vu for me. I cut my teeth in food politics and food policy in the 1960s and 70s, and indeed helped do a sort of very early week of action on British food policy in Sheffield with an experimental theatre group. And I find it very amusing. The last month, I've had not just one, but 2 whole occasions like this that I've been asked to come to. So I think there's something very nice about the experimentalism and the need to turn to artistic measures to reshape and recalibrate the imagination. I think it's fantastic. So I've come to say thank you, actually. Okay, my second point, if you were deeply tired but couldn't sleep and didn't want to take recourse to drugs, alcohol, or some other ghastly method, I would recommend you to read books and articles that my colleagues and I have read, and I guarantee they would send you to sleep very, very quickly indeed. And I will summarize what those say. They essentially say that what we need to do is not clear yet. We've got to shift the population from here to here. We've got to shift behavior from there to here. Big changes have got to be done. I'll say why in a moment. But it's not quite clear how we can do it or where we're going. But some of the criteria by which we can judge this new ecological public health world are becoming clear. I repeat, it's not clear exactly where we're going and where we need to go, but some of the criteria by which we should judge where we should go are becoming clear. Example, we need to cut down greenhouse gas emissions from food, not just a little bit, dramatically. Dramatically. Britain consumes food as though there are 2 to 3 planets. The United States, 3 to 4 planets. And yet our models of eating are the models which many cultures don't directly aspire to. The Chinese wouldn't dream of wanting to eat like us, but they're following trends which we have already gone down. Eating meat not as feast day foods, you notice I'm talking cultural language here, exceptional foods. It takes a lot to rear an animal. I've reared and killed animals. I was a farmer. I look ordinary, but I used to be an anti-hippie farmer.
I'm so sorry, could you speak up a bit?
I will. No, do. I said I'll shut. We've actually got to change the footprint of how we eat, the impact on the planet, how much water we use, how much energy we use. Essentially, food is about resources. Land use, water, oil, biodiversity. We know from the obesity work there's a joining up of the carbon picture from food, how much carbon we are expending, adding to climate change. We know that connects with calories. Not exactly, but there's a very neat link. Carbon is calories. Not always, but there's a really neat connection. And studies we've done and others have done have shown that if we followed the public health dietary guidelines, we'd lower our environmental footprint. And it's mainly by reducing meat and dairy. But the cultural messages are not there. Nothing, when I walk into Clapham Junction train station, which is, I live in South London, I walk past 34 eating establishments. I count them. They go up. It's the permanent eating economy that we have done, and yet we still have this fiction of meal times. So this is a cultural dimension you clever actors and playwrights can explore with. And I think in your discussions over Susan's, you were doing that. So we've got to summarize my second point, we've got to shift from what in my world we call unsustainable diets to sustainable diets. That means eating healthier, eating less, and lowering the environmental impact and other things. And we've got to get those dietary ingredients from a food supply chain that is running away with itself. I'm always saying it, and I started learning this when we were doing the experimental theatre in Sheffield in 1976. Okay, so that's 37 years ago. We go to work to earn money, to buy a car, to go to the hypermarket on the edge of the town and say, wow, isn't this convenient? And then we come back and we've said we've saved time. We haven't actually. We've taken our time. And indeed, one of the plays that a friend of mine, Red Ladder Theatre Group, did was called Taking Our Time. So the time dimension around food is a really interesting concept for you to work on. Third issue. We are clear in my academic world, in the scientific world around food, environment, health, culture, that we know that where we've ended up now, at the beginning of the 21st century, has taken 70 years at least of incredible investment. We are locked in to a billions and indeed trillions of investment legacy. That was bad English. We're locked into the legacy of trillions and trillions of investment. So this hasn't just happened in 10 or 20 years. The entire 20th century has seen incremental change, all of which made sense at the time. But the big thinking was people like Susan and me in the 1920s and 30s began to articulate that the main problems associated with food and health then, which were hunger and malnutrition, not the same thing, underconsumption, could be resolved by investing in fertilizers and science and technology applied to agriculture to increase output. It's what in my world we call the productionist policy package. And huge arguments went on in the 1920s and 30s and essentially won the arguments because of the experience of the Second World War. And in the Second World War, in 1942, in 43, in 44, in 45, planning and thinking went on that people like Susan and I were involved in, our equivalents, boring academics, okay, were wrapped up to say, how can we make the food world better? And they said, invest in production, get more food out. It was a brilliant policy package, and it worked. But within 30 years, the seeds of its problems began to emerge. And by then, the policymakers weren't interested. They'd unleashed this, what has now become a juggernaut, that's changed our choices and framed the conditions. I'll use my phrase again, framed the conditions within which we eat. Fourth point, we have oodles of evidence. Academics always, I look at Susan, we spend all of our time, more research needs to be done. No more research needs to be done. Okay, there are some little tweaking bits. I was talking with Beth earlier. I think we do need to define what we mean by sustainable diets. I've been on scientific committees that have done that at the UN. It's there, we've got it. But how do we translate it for King's Cross? And is it different in King's Cross than in Wales? Do I eat Welsh black grass-fed, Welsh black is a cattle, by the way. I used to be a pedigree breeder of them. Do we eat them in North Wales? Not fed on grain, because the grain is from east of England, and 50% of all the grain on the planet is now going down the throats, not of you and me, but of animals, and then to us. This is a huge land use, and yet we're told, crisis! How can we feed 7 billion people? There's going to be 9 billion by 2050. You see what I'm getting at? There's a really interesting thing here that we've got to say, and this is where theatricals like your good selves come in. What are the cultural rules? What's a good diet? I repeat our phrase. What's a sustainable diet? Would I want to eat it? You've got not one, excess, but 2 bananas. Bananas, Britain's favourite fruit. It comes here, just unpick a banana. The story of the banana is fantastic. So we've got lots of indicators. Let me quickly give some examples. Environment, greenhouse gases. The greenhouse gas emissions of Britain are heavily associated with food. You wouldn't believe it, but 30% of all the greenhouse gases of a European consumer are through food. We have not a chance in hell, let alone heaven, of resolving climate change if we don't sort out the food system. Not a chance. All we're doing, today's Committee on Climate Change, by the way, has just come out with this, rightly so, that Britain's so-called drop in climate change gas emissions has been done because we're actually merely importing. We've closed our industries, but we're importing the BMWs and the cars and the fridges, which others are making, so they're emitting, but we're consuming. And that's a problem, this mismatch between production and consumption. Greenhouse gases, land use, ecosystems. I've spent years of my life trying to think, how can a good diet improve biodiversity? If we don't look after biodiversity, literally the planet cannot breathe. And I'm part of a rather dangerous group of academics and scientists who are saying, eat biodiversity. We need to get the biodiversity into the field and consume that biodiversity, instead of having monoculture in the field and trying to push the biodiversity to the edge. This is a big political battle now. And it's happening around the Amazon, obviously, but it's in here too. Culture is deracinated. What's a good food? London is a city of 150 different ethnic and national origins. They all have different and subtly different definitions of what is nice food. I was brought up in India. I'm white, British. Okay? I was brought up in India until I was nearly 8. When I had cancer 8 years ago and was very ill, was in hospital, you know what all I wanted to eat? Rice and dal, my childhood food. Now, what's a good diet is deeply psychological, deeply rooted. I'll just give that as a personal example. But this is a cultural issue. It's not just me and my rice and dal. I happen to live in southwest London, as I've said, so my hospital is St. George's, second largest Asian subcontinent population on the door, fabulous Indian food in the hospital. So I was like a pig in the proverbial, you know. Well, I wasn't actually, I was very ill. But, you know, good psychological feedback to yours truly. The supply chain is in difficulties. The interesting, what used to be seen, Susan will vouchsafe, and Kath too, we know each other well, the sort of language I'm talking to you in 10 years ago, certainly 40 years ago when I started, would have been seen as dangerous, communist, radical claptrap. Okay? Indeed, I treasure a debate in the House of Commons about an organization that I was director of, was accused of being food terrorists. I mean, actually, it was insulting. Within 2 years, the same paper that had covered that in Parliament said, these people are right. The food system has gone wrong. And this is tricky. This is getting me to one of my big points, which is this is about politics. Big P and little p. Personal politics, individual, family, cultural, the sort of things Susan was talking about, but also macro politics. It's about resources. Who owns the oil that is the essential ingredient for good food? Or, as we've framed it in the 20th century, who owns the land? This is the oldest political argument in European politics for 1,000 years. These are very big issues. The land ownership in Britain is the most concentrated, other than Australia, of the OECD countries. I have one friend who owns 35,000 acres. 35,000 acres. Okay. But the Duke of Westminster owns only, 30 acres in central London, and he's the 8th richest person in Britain. The land don't go by acreage. So we have some indicators about what the politics of this shift that we've got to do, and also the shift of where we've come from. What to do? Wow. I like to think in threes. I was trained by a very clever campaigner when I stopped being an academic for 10 years of life and ran a think tank that turned into a campaigning organization. Always go into any situation where you've made everyone feel suicidal and there's no purpose of living. Let's all go and have at least 14 Big Macs to satisfy our instant gratification. There are some great things going on. For me, the great thing that's going on is democratic experimentalism. It's a boring phrase, but I can't think of anything better. People are experimenting and doing really interesting things in Britain, around the world. I'll give my favorite, which is a thing called the Fife diet. A young couple with young kids in Fife, which is a bloody awful climate area place north of the Forth Bridge, Scotland, said, we're going to try and eat for a year 80% from food within Fife. Cool. No bananas in Fife. Not too many. None grow in Fife. Actually, there are some. No, none in Fife, but just over the Forth Bridge in the Botanic Gardens, they do have some under glass, highly heated. There are some bananas, but that wouldn't qualify as Fife food. Well, there are now 1,000 families doing this, and what did they do? They lost weight. They lost weight, and secondly, they grew. Local farmers started growing plants for them. So the shift that people like me want, which is from agriculture to horticulture, began to happen with consumer shifts. This is interesting. We're always told we live in a consumer-led society. Nonsense. It's messier than that. And the food system is an example of that mess. Actually, the people who are the gatekeepers, they're not controllers, but the gatekeepers of the food system are the retailers and traders. 4 companies, arguably 5, sell 85% of all the food and drink sold in Britain. 1 company, Tesco, sells 1/3 of all the food and drink sold in Britain and takes 1 in 7 pounds of everything, even Beth Thompson of the Wellcome Trust spends. This is power, major power, okay? And all the rhetoric says they're doing what we want. Yes, up to a point. I'm not demonizing them, but I also just want to lay it on the table. What we're talking about here is power, and who makes the money out of it, and who shapes. So when Tesco builds a hypermarket out on the edge of a town, they're shaping my access to food. Actually, they're now all coming back into town at the moment because it's expensive to have a car. So there's a sort of relocalization going on, which is very interesting. So I want to think in your theatricals, can you bring in some of these weird people doing experimental things and trying different sorts of diet and eating in a different way, and maybe demonstrating, as I was doing in Sheffield 38 years ago, against supermarkets, where it was considered completely mad. People in the town near where I farmed, in Preston, were dying to get supermarkets in. They wanted to get rid of Preston's market. Clitheroe's market is gone. So what sort of market economy do we live in? I always say we live in a hypermarket economy, actually. The rhetoric is of a market economy. It isn't. A market means stalls out there and growers saying, come and buy me. So that shift has gone on not in our lifetimes, but in our grandparents and great-grandparents to our lifetime. And it's now happening in the developing world. Second point, I think we've got to sort out the politics. Susan and I and Kath know this is a slightly difficult problem. But my mother, who was a right-wing bourgeois eugenicist, but she was my mother, and I loved her. I loved her, but when when I buried her, I thought, well, at least I don't have to argue with her anymore. You know, we argued right to the end. She always said I'd grow out of it, but I never did. I never did. So I'm obviously just perverse, so I can blame her. But she was a strange woman, but a very clever woman, and of course won the war single-handedly. The thing I've learned from the politics of food is that the politicians follow, they don't lead. But many of us in the food world are now acutely aware that the world of food is walking into crisis. And I don't use that word lightly. I'm an optimist. I've said it again. I'm an optimist. I think we can sort this out. But there is a sort of the drift of the evidence, Beth, I think, would agree, is not good. It's not good. And I have a big paper in a book coming out 2 months' time on tipping points. And that there is an argument that literally climate change is going into tipping points and food, water, and so on. I don't like that metaphor, I have to say. But most analyses done by world consortia of scientists about food and farming issues all point to a structural crisis. Slowly coming, but probably going to go into shocks. I worry about that, and I actually get out, I was saying to Beth, I get out of bed in order to try and prevent that. I don't want that. I think that's bad. You get crisis interactions, and what we've got to do is get grip of the politics to address that before crunches happen. So the politics of food is sometimes at very high level, literally out of sight. There are groups going on that are wonderful artistic opportunities, really wonderful, of power brokers having meetings. You know, Tesco, for example, which is a company I follow a lot, is currently in a crisis internally because the horse meat has exposed how all of its investment for 25 years has not worked. They thought they were in control of their supply chains and they didn't even know what was in their bloody burgers. You know, excuse my language. But I can assure you the language I've had talking to people on the Tesco board makes my language look very polite. They are in internal crisis and they don't know quite how to alter the zillions of investment they've made in their ruthless, globalized supply chain management systems. And there's a battle going on between the board and the suppliers. This is interesting politics. But tonight I meet a shadow spokesperson, and I had a dinner the other day with a whole gang across all parties. You know, that the straight party politics is utterly riveting, but it's not addressing what I've been talking about yet. But they will when the proverbial hits the fan. And the third thing is us. I keep on coming back to this trite phrase. We need to shift from a culture of consumerism. I think it's my right to have 35,000 items to choose from when I go into a Tesco hypermarket. Really? And we play around with the notion of citizenship. It's easy to say. What would food citizenship be? Does it mean not eating the croissant? You know, when Nigel said, go and have a cup of coffee, I went outside to have a cup of coffee and sat in a cafe and thought, isn't this lovely? The sun, reading a depressing paper about resource depletion, 200 pages long. The coffee I was drinking, other than my white bleached shirt, is the second heaviest water user on the planet. Coffee. When you drink coffee, you are drinking water, embedded water, in a major way. Yet I drank it. I loved it. The health evidence says, you know, 1 cup a day, something like that. When you start having more, you start getting certain sorts of cancers. Okay, so there's a bit of a coming together of the health and environment. But what does that mean? And I I think, and I say in front of people I know, I don't know what a good diet is. I know broadly what it is. I've been a government commissioner, we've articulated it. But what do? Do we eat 5 portions of fruit and vegetables a day? No, I think probably 9. For me, the issue that's being raised here is not just what you eat, it's how. How has it got to you? How's it been grown? How much? Who? And if there's one report I'd like you to look at, it came from the Royal Society, a deeply boring body, but deeply respectable and age-old scientific body. Go and read their report. I don't know if you've read it, Beth. People and Planet. It's not people, she's nodding because she's a clever woman. Not People and the Planet, People and Planet. It's a fabulous report. And food is one of the 3 examples they take throughout them. You read it, Nigel? Nigel's read it. Clever boy too. They're just well read. Go and have a look at it. You can read it very quickly. Essentially, it proposes a politics of contract and converge. We need to consume less to allow the developing world to consume more, and we all need to change what we do and how we do it. In one sentence, that's it. Do you want me to repeat it? What did I say? We all need to change what and how we eat, lower what we, I'll put it always differently, lower what we consume, alter how we consume, and allow and encourage low-income countries to consume more. That's the politics that's really tricky, okay? Which is why we need artists to do it. That's it.